everyone, my name is Bola Lawal and welcome to our session on male allyship. Before I begin, I just want to quickly request that we all put our Zooms on mute and on speaker view. So, a male ally is someone who actively works to counteract sexism, gender inequality at home, at work, or in any relationship. Today on our panel, we have 4 incredible individuals and advocates who will be discussing their perspectives on the importance of promoting gender equality and women in leadership. First, we have Paul Evans, who is the CEO of Leadership Fruit Sports and Business. Paul has a background in youth and education services, sports for development, mental health, homelessness, and employability provision. We have Gary Ford, who is an independent consultant working across the IT sector. Gary is also the founder of Moonshot Consultancy Limited. We have Adam Pacifico, who is a Chief Learning Officer at PCA Law. Adam is a barrister and the co-author of the Leader's Secret Code. We also have Nabhan, who is a trainee accountant of the chartered accountancy firm BKL, and Nabhan is also an alumni of the Leadership Fruit Sports and Business program. Before we begin, I'm going to do a quick run through the agenda as well. So we're going to start off with our panelists answering some questions from myself. Following on from that, we're going to have a breakout session where each of our panelists will be rotating in a breakout room. So you guys will have an opportunity to ask some questions of your own to the panelists and speak about this topic in more depth. So without further ado, I'm going to begin with my first question, and that is to you, Gary. So Gary, what does it mean to be a male ally?
Okay, thanks Bola. And maybe just to add, to give a little bit more perspective, prior to setting up my consultancy, I worked for JP Morgan Chase, large US financial services company. And whilst I was there, I created or co-founded their Male Allies program for women in technology. Some of you may realize technology has a particular challenge around diversity. So generally speaking, less than 25% of the workforce are women. So for me, being a male ally means 3 things really. Firstly, I think it's about recognizing that gender inequality is everyone's problem, and that a more gender equal society is good for both men and women, and also people that don't identify with either gender. Plus, there's overwhelming research that shows it's good for companies and for communities. Secondly, I think it's realizing that as a man, you have some level of privilege by the way in which society is structurally designed around you. And that women often face barriers and obstacles that you don't face certainly within the workplace. And therefore you need to maybe make some effort to understand others' lived experiences that are different to yours. And then the final thing I think is you have to try and take action to make a difference. And that can be a range of different things. It could be as simple as calling out issues when you see them. It could be helping people with ideas around everyday inclusion, some of the little things that you can see where maybe men in particular treat women differently to maybe how they treat other men. It's maybe taking time to sponsor or mentor women, particularly in your organizations. And lastly, I think it's maybe recognizing that everyone makes mistakes, and I often still make mistakes on subjects like this, but it's maybe recognizing that that's okay as long as you maybe apologize and promise to do a little bit better next time.
I totally agree with that. I think in order for change, I always said in order for change to occur, I think we will have to be on board and be dedicated to making changes in every single way that we can. So Paul, the next question is for you. So let's start with your experience. What are some of the personal experiences or compelling arguments that have influenced your thinking around gender and have motivated you to get involved with being an advocate for gender equality?
Okay, well, firstly, thank you for doing this, Bola. What a great introduction. I've never been described as an incredible person. So I'm going to record that and keep that. Thank you very much. Compelling arguments or reasons why. I don't really have any compelling arguments as to why I care about this, other than a fundamental belief, like many of us here today, that, I believe in fairness, social justice, equality, and that people deserve the same rights and opportunities as other people. So there's that fundamental belief. And then like Gary was saying, as you go through life, you start to realize the advantages or the privileges that you have, and somewhat unfair privileges. So that might be being white, it might be being male, and then you start to think to yourself as you mature, well, then what do I do with this? If this gives me positions of power or influence or an ability to positively or negatively impact on other people's lives, how do I want to use these advantages and unfair impacts of me having privilege? So it's about reflection and thinking about that and maturing and confronting yourself with what am I going to do with this relative privilege?
Yeah, I think that's totally true as well, to be honest with you. So, but my next question is to Nabhan. So Nabhan, what are some of the ways that you believe that men can be good allies to women? We can't hear you, Nabhan. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I just realised, sorry about that. So some of the ways that I think men can definitely be allies in the workplace, actionable steps that you can take. I think Gary, he sort of detailed a few, but definitely making an effort to sort of include women, young ladies in decision-making scenarios. So any sort of lunchtime meetings that do happen at BKL, which aren't sort of mandatory, if you notice that there isn't sort of a female representation there, you can sort of suggest it to a colleague of yours. And even in that sort of way, you can say, we're having a meeting now, I've noticed there aren't any, we don't have a sort of female representation, would you like to come? So making an effort to do that sort of thing. Keeping an eye out for any inequality that you may come across, but also calling it out. Because I also do think that people can get wrapped up into believing that just sort of being able to notice it is enough. But you do then have to sort of take action on that, call it out, sort of mention it to a superior, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of courage to do things like that. Now, you want to say some more?
Yeah, no, I think those are the actionable steps that you can take, definitely.
Yeah. So Adam, what are some of the what would organizations look like if our gender equality goals were met?
Hi Bola, and thanks for that, and hi to everyone. I just love LTSB, I just have to say. So it's a real privilege to be
happy to have you on board.
Oh, thanks Bola. So I'm passionate about this subject matter for a couple of reasons. You know, I watched my wife struggle as a female lawyer in a heavily male dominated and slightly macho environment, and so in some ways I vicariously lived what she was going through and the battles that she had to try and in some ways to be seen as equal in that. You know, I work with organizations all over the world, which is a privilege, and there's a real challenge. And let me just say what that challenge is. And it's not through mischief, it's this. It's interpersonal comfort tends to trump organizational change. And what that means is that leaders tend to look for people who sound like them, look like them, think like them, not through mischief, because there's a comfort associated with it. And I'm not suggesting that you know, a very homogenous group like I've described can't drive change. They can, but it tends to be iterative change, and it tends to be piecemeal change. So in answer to your question, you know, what would organizations look like when the equality goals are met? I'm going to mention three things, and I'm going to echo some things that have already been said. The first one is that an organization that gets this right will understand that it is a strategic advantage, because there's a very clear relationship between inclusion and transformational change, because you get increased levels of creativity, innovation, and agility that diversity brings. And that actually takes some courage for leaders to go out and find people who don't look like them, who don't sound like them, who don't think like them, and who will openly challenge them. And women make a huge percentage of the diversity element of the workforce. So, you know, that's what I mean by it's a strategic advantage. Secondly, and I think this has already been mentioned, certainly by Gary, is, and I completely agree with this too, is that gender balance is a business issue, not a women's issue. So an organization that gets this right understands that this is everybody's issue. So traditional approaches maybe to female progression have sat sometimes with the female population. Well, that can't be right, because this topic has a significant effect on the overall company performance, which includes everybody. So we can't create balance by engaging half the population. It requires radical collaboration between both men and women. So an organisation that gets this right understands it's a company-wide issue. And then thirdly, and most of my time is spent working with leaders and in the world of leadership, is that an organisation that gets this right, every single leader will take responsibility for driving the culture that is a culture of inclusivity. And they'll recognise and they'll challenge collective biases. And by the way, that can be quite painful within an organisation. And it's really the role of every single individual leader to create a climate of inclusion so that leaders are challengers, champions, and co-creators. So those are the three things that I would suggest may well be the ingredients of success or progression for an organisation that has really understood and embraced this challenge, this important challenge.
Oh, that's great, Adam. I think everyone will probably agree with you on a lot of those points, and those are great ideas that I believe a lot of organisations should really take on board. It doesn't take just a small change; it needs to be a radical change for things to happen. And a lot of things in history where change has been made has not been from people just making small little steps. You need to really change the status quo, and I think a lot of the points you made are really relevant and can be taken on board today by a lot of organisations. So, Nabhan, what has been the most effective support you've received from women at work?
I would maybe have to say mentorship. Of course, we spoke about having the awareness to understand problems that don't specifically pertain to you. So, yeah, the most effective support I would have received would have been mentorship. And maybe even being given advice on how to conduct myself in the workplace and encouraging me to sort of think about how I may come across as a male in the workplace, which maybe isn't a perspective that would have come had I had male mentorship. And that sort of encouraged me to sort of delve into a whole another way of thinking, which sort of makes you a more rounded sort of candidate in a working environment.
I agree with that. So when I started in my career as well, I had a lot of support from women when I started off, but as I've started to progress, I've had a lot of mentorship from men also, and it's been great having support from both sides because as always, there's different perspectives, and they've really taught me how the things I need to do to progress further in my career, and just giving me support and advice whenever I've needed it. So I think it's really important to have that type of mentorship from both men and women. So I'm glad that you've had that. So, Gary, what do you think we're missing out on by not maximizing on the talents from both genders?
Great question, Bola. I mean, and I think Adam's maybe touched on this a bit, but yeah, there is overwhelming research that shows how not only companies make more money, you know, by having a more diverse workforce, but they are more innovative. So where companies have made bad choices around the products and services they release by not thinking through the demographic that might buy their products. The most obvious example is like airbags. When airbags were first introduced into cars, they ended up killing lots of women and children because they've been designed for men. You even saw the same recently with PPE equipment arriving at the NHS front line and not being designed for women, only fitting the men. So I think there's lots of things that are happening that that will really impact company success unless they begin to take this subject seriously. So it is about harnessing some of the kind of the different thoughts and practice. A lot of innovation comes from putting diverse perspectives together. It's also, I think, for companies, there's more and more evidence showing how a more diverse workforce is far more engaged. They put in extra discretionary effort. They believe in their company. And then finally, I think any company that wants to be successful, they have to realize their clients now expect this, right? Their clients are looking for diverse teams to come and work with them. So I think, yeah, unless companies really embrace this, then they're not going to be successful in a future world.
Definitely. So, Paul, I know we haven't come to you since from the start. I just wanted to say, what issues do you believe that women face and men generally do not?
Okay, so a number of different challenges are faced by young women. We'll start with one. The choice sometimes in a woman's life, if they're thinking about children and family, the choice to put one above the other. So do I have a family? Do I have children? Or do I continue my career trajectory and do well in this? And that's not a negative in itself, other than the systems can make it then hard for females to come back into the workplace and thrive and get back onto where they were and to flourish within their career. So it can be a harder choice. It's a difficult choice, and one that shouldn't need to be difficult. Also, care and responsibilities around the house and caregiving, and for some young women that we work with, looking after siblings sometimes or contributing financially to the household. All of these things, these disproportionate things that fall on women's shoulders, can make it really difficult to get onto the career ladder, to progress into opportunities. And we know that there are barriers to women from certain types of backgrounds accessing apprenticeship opportunities, traineeship opportunities, and entry-level jobs, and therefore progressing into higher paid jobs. There are those barriers. The other thing is around behaviours. It's sometimes thought that leadership behaviours are masculine behaviours, whether that be competitiveness or assertiveness, or things that seem to be positioned around masculinity. And that if females display those kind of behaviours or qualities, they are judged against them. And statistics say that. There's research to say that if a woman who comes across as what is deemed to be more masculine, then that can negatively impact them in their career. So all these different challenges need to be sorted out within the organisation in terms of how we behave, how we talk, how we speak to one another, how males can support other male allies, and then how we can change systems and flexibility and culture and all the things I've said don't have to be barriers. They're not inherent disadvantages. We just need to sort them out within the workplace so that everybody can flourish and thrive as they should.
Yeah, it's great to get everyone on the same playing field. I think that's the important thing as well. So, Adam, this question's for you. How have you addressed your own workplace culture to be more inclusive to women?
That's a great question, isn't it, Bola? Because this is a kind of, Adam, you might talk a good game, but what have you actually done about it? So this is, it's cracking from that respect. Listen, we work really hard with our clients and ourselves in order to try and create, firstly, a culture of inclusivity, because it's not just a male and female challenge. When we talk about that diversity and that diversity of thought, there are more groups that we really need to try and make sure that we're utterly inclusive for. I used a term in my earlier answer, which was radical collaboration, and it's not my term. I had the chance of working with Stanford University over in California with the Design Thinking School. And they have really built a very successful methodology based on radical collaboration, that ability to courageously go out and find and work with people who think and are very, very different. So how have we done that at PCA? Well, over half of us are female, but we haven't done very well in relation to male, female on the leadership team. And actually that's something that we've just started to address, where we now have asked another one of our incredibly talented people who is female, who's now joining the leadership team because of just the sheer skill and capability that she has. But let me put this into context, because whilst I hope we're doing well, we've got a lot more to do if I critique ourselves. And in some ways, and if anyone's got a piece of paper, I'm trying to get this out of my head, you can write, is think of 5 steps, Bola, okay?
Yeah.
And the first step, the lowest, is an organisation that's unaware. And that's the kind of like, what's the point of inclusion? What's the point? Then a step up is almost compliant. And that's an organisation that says inclusion has to be done, so we've got to do it. It's almost like a tick box, a compliance issue. Then you think of the third step, and I call that strategic. And that's where inclusion is important to our success. The fourth step, I would say, is integrated, where inclusion is part of everything that we do. And then the fifth step is that disruptive, where an organization is leading inclusion best practices, and they're a disruptor in the field. Well, I think if I really critique us, I would hope that we're on the third step, strategic, and we're trying to move to the fourth step, which is inclusion is part of everything we do. It's part of our very DNA. So so we're doing okay, but we need to do better as well. And I think that goes for all the work that we do with leaders, where rhetoric and platitudes and lip service to something this important doesn't cut it unless the action is congruent with the words. So that's where we are.
I can't wait for you guys to get to that next step.
Could I just add something to Adam's point there? That was really well made. But I think one of the signs, I think, of very mature organizations in this is when it becomes very clear that their incentives are aligned to promoting the right behaviors. I think one of the best examples I've seen of that is Dell Technologies, who basically have agreed what the behaviors of their senior leaders need to look like. They measure those behaviors, they make those measurements public, and then they pay people according to it. So 1/3 of their compensation is related to how much they live the behaviors that their organization have agreed is important. And I think more companies that try to align their incentive kind of practices to cater for that, I think that's a kind of very mature operating model.
That's great. So Paul, do you have any points to add to that as well regarding the organization culture?
Well, just probably building on that point, actually, I was on a webinar just this morning, and one of the other panel members was chief economist and director of investments for a big investment firm. And they were saying that unless the companies that they are looking to invest in have objectives around diversity and culture and all of these things that Gary and Adam just talked about, then they will be less likely to invest, and probably not at all, because they realize that their investments can drive certain outcomes. They can influence business outcomes through their investments. So that's an interesting way to think about it, that you know, you won't partner with an organization, or you won't invest, or you won't endorse unless you see measurable impacts around all of the things that we're discussing.
Yeah, I think ethical investing is also something I've been hearing about a little bit more recently as well, about organizations not just talking the talk, but also the way you do your business as well should be ethical and should align with the values that you say that you have. So I think that's very important. I think that's a crucial step towards getting to that point as well. We make things more equal for everyone. So I think the next step we're going to have now is going to be the breakout session. And I think Nana's going to take over in this session. So at this point as well, the audience will have an opportunity to ask our panelists some questions. Our panelists will rotate in each breakout room, so you get to speak to every single one of them in more depth as well. So have your questions ready, and if you have anything to say to them, you can do that in this time.
I would say to anyone, having become a male ally, I think it's made me better at leading and managing and coaching people. Actually, I think it's made me slightly better at being a father and being a kind of a husband and a friend. And the most important thing that became apparent to me is the fact that we were having all these great conversations and I was learning lots, but there were no other men in this conversation. And actually, they needed it the most. So the reason I now do it is I think this is good for men. I'm really convinced about it. And I just want to talk to more men.
I've got a question. What's the best way, do you think, to educate yourself on this topic?
I think so. For me, I can only sort of speak from my experience, but so for me, why I wholeheartedly sort of welcome this experience today to be part of the panel is because almost ashamedly, admittedly, it is something that I hadn't sort of considered or educated myself on previously. So being involved in today's experience sort of forced me to have to take a look into it and educate myself on it. And then you're able to sort of radiate that education onto others, number one, and then you're sort of able to, your newfound education will come out in your acts and how you conduct yourself at work. So I know for a fact that just my demeanor at work or sort of the things I pay attention to at work will be different simply now, because I've researched and sort of educated myself a little bit more on these topics.
I think it was slightly touched upon earlier about how when women sort of bring masculine like personality traits to like meetings and stuff, like why is there a viewed difference between men when they are aggressive, they're seen as passionate, and women are just seen as aggressive or emotional? Like where do we think that comes from, and why do we think that is?
I think people sort of tend to stick to how things have been traditionally done. And I think in doing so, you sort of look for characteristics that have traditionally been assigned to either males or females. But I think with the whole talk about inclusion and diversity, we're moving more towards a place where senior management and companies on a whole want the best ideas to come from their companies, and that takes the best decisions to be made. And then it's like a chain reaction thing. So for the best decisions to be made, we need to sort of consider all relevant input, and not just input from, let's say, the most dominant in the room or those who have traditionally been the most dominant in the room. So I think we're sort of moving more towards that sort of place. But I think to go more specifically back to your question, I think it's just a case of sort of, and I think Gary mentioned it, being comfortable and just sort of sticking with what traditionally has been done and keeping an eye out for behaviors that traditionally have been assigned to males and females and that sort of thing.
Yeah. We were just asking a few questions to obviously Nabhan, and I think I'd just like to obviously start with asking you this question. Where do you think the problem stems from with inequality? Do you think it is a systematic issue? And where do you think it stems from originally?
So me, Shemaine?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I think all of these things, you know, are about education and about comfort zone. There's an exposure. You know, if you don't know about things, if you're not educated, if you come from a certain demographic, I grew up in a white working class town, for example, and you're growing up and you're not exposed to other cultures of the vast, colourful tapestry of life, then you know you're uneducated, which means you have a narrow view of the world. And if you stick with that and you don't become more educated and open your horizons and expand your horizons, you can stay trapped in those things, you know. And then if you're around other people who perpetuate discrimination or lack of diversity or create negative and toxic cultures, then that can just become the norm. So I absolutely think it's about exposure, education, and widening your horizons, which is what we're all about here, isn't it?
Just following on from that then, how do we kind of encourage our male colleagues to be more active in kind of noticing things and spotting it out? Because sometimes I feel like I'm the one in the meeting saying, oh, actually we don't have the female representation in this room, but I feel like sometimes that could be something my male white counterpart could be doing more.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you a quick example here. I used to work at a football organisation, quite male dominated, but there were females in the room, and in my second week I had to talk to the whole team and call out what they define as banter. And we all know there's an issue with banter because usually someone else is always at the end of it. So we're always the victim of it. So what I did in that kind of scenario is not call out individuals so much, because you can get into an adversarial situation where, oh, here she goes again, or here he goes again. I actually brought in external facilitation. I thought we need to all engage in a process, all engage in some training, and work back from someone else bringing it to the table, and then us discussing it after, as opposed to me fronting the whole thing, you know, and putting myself in a certain situation. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't call out explicitly negative behavior. It's our duty to look out for one another on a human level, by the way, whatever. We should look out for each other and call out bad practice and toxic behavior. But I think to sort it out organizationally, bringing external facilitation is the way to do that and work at it together.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking about it's similar to when
you come into the office, all the men are talking about football, so that can easily cut out quite a lot of females. Not trying to say women don't talk about football, but imagine there's a group of people just talking about what they bought on the weekend, that can really exclude a lot of people. So I think that can kind of feed into the culture of not accepting and not being inclusive.
It can, because you won't think, because the people think, people discussing football won't think we are doing this to alienate. They're just doing it. But if you have kind of training and awareness raising around this stuff, it starts to challenge people's thinking about the small things, the micro things that altogether, culminate to something really negative for somebody else.
I suppose I was just thinking about, like, in certain areas where you either get more female candidates or more male candidates, do you think there's an argument for maybe CVs being anonymous and maybe reviewing the language that's used in job applications to try and get a broader field of candidates?
Yes, absolutely do. And nice to see you on here, Steph. I know you care about these things. I think blind auditioning, if you like, blind recruitment. We don't need to know where you come from, what your postcode is, what you look like. We don't need to know any of this stuff. We need to know what your answer is. We need to know how passionate you are, who you are. And there'll be a time when we find out in the recruitment, process who you are. Hopefully, when you turn up, to do the job. Yeah. But we have to think about what barriers do we put in place for people that absolutely do not need to be there, just because they've always been there. Because we tell ourselves we need to know this and we need to know this. We don't really need to know a lot. Not until we really need to know. So we need to get rid of decision bias and confirmation bias and recruitment practices that filter people out. And then people say, well, let's use technology because that's impartial. Apart from people build technology, and people can put bias into systems. Systems don't do it on their own. So all of those things you are saying are right, and that's what I think about it.
Have you just got any top tips, Paul, on educating yourself for, like, maybe younger males, younger people in general?
Yeah. Oh, it looks like I've got 30 seconds to do all my top tips. So here goes. I would say, do you know what? I love watching YouTube. I love learning stuff on YouTube, and I learn random stuff on YouTube as well. But I try to educate myself through talks and documentaries, and I try and read a lot. And I don't ever make it to the end of a book, I don't think, but I'm always doing my best to learn, research, read, and just become better and wiser, and working on my character as much as what I know, because there's a head and the heart, and if you need to develop both.
Thank you very much. So we were just talking to Paul, and Paul mentioned there's barriers that are in place in certain organisations. What barriers do you think are in place in organisations that maybe need to be removed to make the equality better for women?
I'll tell you what one of the biggest challenges, and I've mentioned it in one of the other rooms as well, is it's about courage and permission at any level to challenge the behaviour when they see or hear that behaviour. Because this is relevant to not just sexism, racism, discrimination. All of that firstly has to be non-negotiable in an organisation and far beyond, but it has to be non-negotiable. But one of the biggest barriers is a lot of people feel that they don't have either the authority or the permission to challenge behaviour which falls well below the line. And so I work, sometimes with senior executives who still themselves don't feel they have the courage or the authority or the permission to challenge the behaviour when they see it or where they hear it. So one of the biggest barriers is having a true culture of inclusivity where the newest and most junior person could hear or see something and say to someone quite senior, that behaviour is just not appropriate in 2020. That behaviour is not conducive to a culture of inclusivity within this. And so for me, it's easier said than it is done, because it takes huge courage. And who 3 months into a job at 23 years old is going to go to the vice president who's 42 and got 20 years and say, in relation to what you've just said as regards females, that's not cool, that's not right, and actually that's not acceptable. So that's I think one of the biggest challenges is having a culture where people feel safe, secure, and able to challenge behaviour that falls well below the line. I don't know, what do people think in relation to that? Any thoughts? Don't be shy now, folks.
I'll jump in on that because that actually happened to me on the first day I joined at my place.
Wow.
I shook a partner's hand and he was like, "You're very strong for a little Chinese girl." And I've already signed the contract and I was just very much like, "Oh, well, I'll just brush it aside." I was standing right next to the HR person. She's like, "Oh, well, let's just move on to talk to the next person." And I think it's not because, not only did I not have the courage to say anything, but it's also, it was one of those kind of microaggressions that you kind of just accept because you just think that's the society. So I get your point, Adam, is having that safe space and culture for everyone at whatever level you are to call out people. But I think we don't feel comfortable in society in the first place.
Yeah, and Davina, that's a really great example. And I think, you know, there's always a time and a place. So don't get me wrong. We always work on a premise of you praise in public and you chastise in private. So what may have happened, you hope, was that HR would have made a meeting with that person to say, listen, that conversation, that's not cool and that's not acceptable. If that took place, I applaud it, because it may be that they didn't want to raise it right there and then, which many people should or could. But if it isn't addressed at all, then you understand the culture you're moving into, right? And that's what I mean by people having the safety and the courage and the permission to say, that's not right, that's not cool. And again, what a difficult position for you to be in within 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And just think of the view you now have, all the aspiration and excitement you've got of this new role, this new organization, and suddenly you're kind of thinking, hang on, is this the place to be? So when you talk about managing the talent, that's not a very good way of managing your talent either. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Do you think that equality is getting better, and that obviously as the generations move and shift as they always do, that it is getting better, or there's obviously we've still got a long way to go, but do you think there's been a change?
I think there has, and there's a long way to go. I think this is a work in progress. Discrimination per se is work in progress. I think I get frustrated that in 2020 we're not further forward than we are. I think as a race, as a collective, we don't seem to learn very fast. Some of these things we really don't. But I do think there has been traction. I think there has been improvement, but there's a long way to go. There really is, right across the board.
Welcome back, everyone. So we're now at the end of our session for the day. It's gone quite quickly, and I wish we had a bit more time because I think it was really great hearing some of the questions that our audience had for our panelists. I hope you've all enjoyed this session. I want to thank all our panelists again for you taking that time out to speak to our young people and just to give them advice and just give them a bit of background and about your experience and how they can be, obviously the males, how they can be better male allies, and also the women, how to deal with the place of work going forward. The next session in our Her Power Hour series is Building Resilience, which is on Friday, the 21st of August at 1 to 2 p.m. So it'll be great to have you guys all on board for that session as well. It's going to be great. And thank you for everyone that supports the Leadership Through Sports and Business program. And I really hope you all enjoyed our session today. Thank you, guys.